minus 40 degrees, no furnace, no fiberglass bats, no building code telling you what R-value your walls need to be. Just a log cabin, a family, and a winter that wants to kill you. Here is the thing that should stop you in your tracks. Those settlers survived. Not just survived, they raised children, kept livestock alive, stored food, and built communities across some of the coldest inhabited land on Earth. They did it with hand tools, local materials, and knowledge we have mostly stopped teaching. Let me show you how. The first wave of European settlers pushing into the Canadian interior arrived in a landscape that made their homeland look mild. The boreal forest stretched for hundreds of miles. Winters in the Ottawa Valley, the Laurentians, and the Canadian Shield regularly dropped to minus 30 or minus 40 Celsius. These were not people with access to hardware stores or sawmills in every town. Many of them were clearing land with hand axes, building their first shelter before the ground froze solid, and learning fast that the techniques they brought from Europe needed serious adaptation. The log itself was the first layer of insulation, and most people underestimate it. A log wall 12 to 16 inches thick has a decent thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the day and radiates it slowly back at night. It does not have a high R value by modern standards, maybe R 1.5 per inch, but thermal mass is not the same thing as R value. Thermal mass slows the movement of temperature. It buffers swings. A thick log wall does not stop cold the way foam board does. It delays it, and in a climate where you are burning wood around the clock, that delay is what keeps you alive. But the log was only the beginning. The real enemy was not the wall itself. It was the gaps. Log cabins breathe. They settle. They shrink and expand with moisture and temperature, and every gap between logs is a channel for minus 40 air to drive straight into your living space. The settlers knew this better than any modern building scientist because they felt it immediately. Chinking was the answer, and the sophistication of how they chinked a cabin is one of the most underappreciated pieces of field engineering in North American history. Chinking was a two-part system. The first part was the fill material, something with body that could pack into the gap and hold its shape. Settlers used whatever the land gave them. Dried sphagnum moss was a favorite across the Canadian Shield because it compresses well, holds its form, and has natural antimicrobial properties that resist rot. Wood chips, straw, animal hair, and shredded bark were all used depending on the region and the season. The goal was to create a dense, flexible plug that moves slightly with the logs without cracking out. The second part of chinking was the daubing layer, the outer seal that locked the fill in place and weatherproofed the joint. This is where settlers got creative with chemistry they understood intuitively, even if they could not name the compounds. The most common daub mix was clay, lime, and animal hair, and the clay provided body. The lime created an alkaline environment that resisted mold and insects. The animal hair, usually from cattle or horses, acted as a fiber reinforcement. The same principle behind modern fiber reinforced concrete. This mixture was worked into the gap over the moss fill and smoothed flat to shed water. Now here is something most people miss entirely. The roof was far more dangerous than the walls. Heat rises. In a single room cabin with a low ceiling, most of your fire's energy was heading straight up and out through whatever was above your head. Early settlers addressed this with a technique that looks almost absurdly simple until you understand the physics. They packed the attic space, or the space between the ceiling boards and the roof, with natural insulating material. Dried leaves, sawdust, straw, and most effectively, dry moss packed to a depth of 12 inches or more. 12 inches of dry moss in an attic space performs surprisingly well as insulation. Dry organic material traps still air, and still air is the actual insulator. This is the same principle behind down feathers, wool fleece, and modern fiberglass bats. The material itself is not what keeps heat in. The material holds air in place, and stationary air resists heat transfer. Settlers did not know the term convective heat loss, but they understood that moving air was the enemy and that anything that stopped air from moving was their ally. Packed moss stops air movement. It works. The floor was another vulnerability that settlers attacked with a layered approach. Many early cabins had dirt floors, which is not as primitive as it sounds. Packed earth has significant thermal mass and stays at a relatively stable temperature because it is connected to the ground below the frost line. Settlers who had plank floors often banked them with straw or sawdust underneath, and nearly all of them covered the floor with heavy woven rugs, animal hides, or braided mats. These were not decorative choices. They were insulating layers that separated bare feet and sleeping bodies from the cold ground. Windows were the weak point in any settler cabin, and the settlers knew it. Glass was expensive and fragile and often unavailable in remote areas. Many early cabins used oiled paper or scraped animal hide stretched over window frames instead of glass. These materials let in diffused light while blocking wind. When glass did appear, it was single pane and thin, and settlers compensated by hanging heavy wool blankets or sewn deerskin curtains over the windows at night. This was not just comfort. A thick curtain over a single pane window can cut heat loss through that opening by more than half. The door was another critical heat loss point, and settlers engineered it more carefully than people give them credit for. Many settler cabins had a double-door entry system, essentially a small enclosed vestibule between the outer door and the inner door. You step in, close the outer door, then open the inner door. This airlock eliminated the blast of -40 air that would otherwise flood the cabin every time someone entered. In regions where lumber was scarce, settlers hung heavy animal hide curtains as a substitute. The physics are identical. You are creating a buffer zone of trapped air between two temperature environments. Banking was one of the most effective and most forgotten techniques in the settler toolkit. Every autumn, before the ground froze, settlers would pile earth, straw, leaves, or snow directly against the base of the cabin walls, sometimes 2 or 3 feet high. This banking layer covered the most vulnerable part of the structure, the joint between the foundation and the lowest log course, where cold air infiltration was worst. It also insulated the foundation itself. Snow is an excellent insulator. Indigenous peoples across the North had known this for centuries, and settlers learned it quickly or paid for the ignorance with a very cold winter. The fireplace and the wood stove were the heart of the thermal system, but the settlers understood something about heat management that modern forced air heating has made us forget. They did not try to heat the air, they heated the mass. Stone hearths, clay ovens, and later cast iron stoves all work by absorbing enormous amounts of heat from the fire and releasing it slowly over hours. A well-built stone fireplace with a proper back wall and damper could radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours after the fire died down. The stone was the battery, the fire was just the charger. The settlers also managed heat zones inside the cabin deliberately. They slept in lofts above the main room because heat rises, and a loft above a fire-warmed room could be 15 degrees warmer than the floor level below. Children and elderly family members were positioned in the warmest sleeping spots. Animals were sometimes kept in an attached barn that shared a wall with the cabin, and that shared wall transferred animal body heat directly into the living space. A cow generates roughly the same heat output as a small space heater. This is not a folk tale. It is basic thermodynamics. There is a technique called the mud plaster interior coat that most people have never heard of, and it deserves its own moment. After a cabin was built and chinked, many settlers applied a layer of clay plaster directly to the interior log surfaces. This coat sealed any remaining micro gaps in the wood grain, added thermal mass to the interior walls, and created a surface that reflected firelight more effectively than raw, dark wood. Some settlers whitewashed over this plaster with a lime wash, which brightened the interior dramatically and added another layer of air sealing. The old ways worked for a reason. Let me show you why. Step back and look at the whole system together, and something remarkable emerges. The settlers were not using any single technique. They were layering passive heating strategies the same way a modern building engineer would layer a thermal envelope. Log mass for buffering, chinking for air sealing, banking for foundation insulation, loft sleeping for heat stratification, stone hearths for thermal mass heating, vestibule entries for airlock buffering. Every single one of these techniques addresses a specific heat loss pathway: conduction, convection, or radiation. They solved this centuries ago. The question is why we forgot. What I want you to take away from this is not nostalgia. It is a framework. Every single technique we cover today can be adapted to a modern property with minimal materials and zero dependence on supply chains. Moss chinking has a modern equivalent in hemp fiber and clay. Banking translates directly to earthen berming. The vestibule principle is in every well-built passive house design on the planet. These settlers were not primitive. They were engineers working with what the land gave them, and they got the engineering right. The archive is there. The knowledge did not disappear. It just stopped being taught. If you want to go deeper on any one of these techniques, I have got dedicated videos on thermal mass heating, natural chinking materials, and the earthen berming methods that were standard practice until the 1950s. Drop a comment below telling me which one you want to see first, because that is how I decide what goes into production next. If this video gave you something useful, hit subscribe. There are no algorithms being gamed here, no sponsored products being pushed. Just the archive, opened up and explained. New video drops every week. I will see you in the next one.